of care. The LEAP's mission is to advance a radically hopeful vision for how we can address climate change by building a more just world, while building movement power and popular support to transform it into a lived reality. And our final host, the Tiny House Warriors, is a grassroots movement, part of a mission to stop the Trans Mountain Pipeline that is attempting to be built, and is a movement that's around building tiny houses that are being placed strategically along the 518 kilometers Trans Mountain Pipeline route to assert Secwepemc law and jurisdiction and block access to the pipeline. So today we're also joined by host Naomi Klein for a panel discussion with Indigenous land protectors on economic analysis and strategies behind our various blockades. So as we close out the year of Shut Down Canada, which started with the Wet'suwet'en resistance in the early parts of this year, this webinar goes beyond the media headlines into discussion about international Indigenous human rights, injunctions, criminalization of land defenders, and the uncertainty of Canadian claims to land and sovereignty. I myself have spent the past 3 years living on Wet'suwet'en territory as a land defender, and I'm now in Toronto, sort of shifting my work into the realm of education and into my role at Ryerson and my role at Yellowhead Institute. One of the things that we were talking about before we got started here is that all of the land defenders present have been arrested in connection to our various activism and resistance movements. And so we've all faced this form of criminalization that attempts to contain and control our lives as Indigenous peoples. And I want to acknowledge that the experience of doing this work, of continuing to be on the front lines of land defense, can be incredibly isolating. It can be traumatizing in the spectacular forms of state violence, and also in the daily wear of continuously being surveilled and harassed by police, by watching industry come in and attempt to do damage to the territories that we hold and try to protect. And that events like this are so crucial so that we can reach out across this continent, across Turtle Island, and see the different forms of resistance to this common enemy that we're fighting, and to get a sense of what it is we're actually fighting and try to understand the contours of the violence that we face as Indigenous peoples. And so we talk about these spaces as front lines for a reason. And we say front lines because we continue to be in spaces of siege and spaces of war, where our animal relations, our lands and waters and peoples and relatives are under attack from an occupying settler state force. And so as Indigenous peoples, then we're constantly criminalized. Our authority is constantly undermined on our own territories, and our lives and freedom are contained. And in that context, the Canadian state, when we assert ourselves and assert our own autonomy and attempt to take some control back over our lands and waters, we're accused of holding Canada hostage, which is what happened in the aftermath of the raids on Wet'suwet'en territory in the early part of this year. And so when we shut down Canada and they accused, especially the rail blockades mounted by the Mohawks, of holding Canada hostage, we have to remember that the attempt to contain has been always throughout history to contain Indigenous lands and lives in order to ransack them for Canadian profit. And so this movement to try and paint Indigenous peoples as the ones holding the Canadian economy hostage, I think needs to be sort of pulled away so that we understand the ways in which the whole economy is structured around the theft of our lands, around ransacking natural resources that our lands hold, and around continuing to contain the threat of Indigenous autonomy. So with that, I want to turn this discussion over to our host and moderator, Naomi Klein. So thank you so much for opening up this discussion and for being here to help facilitate.
Thank you so much, Anne, for those really rich framing remarks. I want to thank everybody at the LEAP and Yellowhead as well, especially Sherry Pasternak. I'm speaking to you from the unceded lands of the Sechelt Nation on the coast of the Salish Sea, and I'm grateful for that. And I'm so grateful to be in conversation with this incredible group of land protectors and land defenders. All of you have been involved in land defense movements recently that have been very much in the news, but also throughout your entire lives, from coast to coast on these lands to protect your territories from extraction, development, and encroachment, from colonial occupation, in short. One of the ways we can describe this power struggle is through the concept of the ransom economy, the title of our conversation today. And this is a title that Kanahus Manuel came up with when we were trying to describe the economic dynamics of colonialism today. So my first question relates to that. We can say that the ransom economy is a way that governments hold Indigenous peoples hostage to the settler economy through various strategies, like an endless and flawed land claims process or through systemic impoverishment. But the ransom economy is also a counter strategy to assert Indigenous jurisdiction, as Anne was just saying, as embodied by the Shut Down Canada movement and the Land Back movement. So Kanahus, since this is your framing, I want to start with you. Beginning with settler governments, in what ways have you experienced Canada as economically holding your community or nation ransom?
Thank you, Naomi. Waikakwaita Kanahus Pesky Manuel here from the Secwepemc Nation. There's many different ways, and particularly right now with our battle against the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion that proposes to and threatens to go through over half this pipeline threatens our nation, 518 kilometers of our Secwepemc territory that's being threatened right now by Trans Mountain, which whether it's Trans Mountain or Imperial Metals or, New Gold or any of these corporations, extractive industries that are coming in our territory, they're always the ones that have first choice and first access to our lands. Because the way that the government has set up here in Canada is to actually speed in access to our territories through land referral processes that go through the band offices. And people may say, like, what are these land referrals and how does that get access to your lands? Well, corporations are bound by law to get the free prior informed consent of Indigenous peoples. And when they don't, and they don't go to the proper Indigenous people to get this consent, they're violating our laws and they're holding our lands, for ransom. They're saying, if you don't allow us to go through these lands, then we're going to arrest you. We're going to apply for injunctions. We're going to use the police and get enforcement orders, and we're going to physically remove you from this land. And my father called these injunctions Canada's legal billy club, but there's many different ways that Canada has gotten access to our territories without our consent. It's been happening since Canada first set foot on our lands. And therefore, I say that our lands have always been held ransom by Canada. Yet Canada continues to say that whenever we blockade, like right here, where we're blockading the Trans Mountain man camps, that we're holding the economy ransom. And every time that Native people stand up, that we're holding the economy ransom. But it's the opposite of that, because our economy is Indigenous economies, and that includes the caribou, the moose, the deer, the salmon, the waters, everything that flows from our land, our culture that flows from our land, our language that flows from the land. And without land, we aren't Indigenous peoples. We can't continue to practice our way without our land. We flow from the land, and you can't separate us from the land. We are a part of our own Indigenous economies. We're never separated. Everything that's on our land is our relative. And I guess I'll end it there, but I just want everybody to know very clearly that Canada is very in a very meticulous and thought out process, finding ways to eliminate us off of our territories. And this is genocide. Federal reports have admitted it was genocide. So we're here today to expose this and to, connect the dots on how this blockades and shut down Canada actually affect Canadia's economy, but also devalues our economy by pushing these pipelines and real estate development, other things through our lands. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Kanahus. And I want to ask you, Molly, the same question from the standpoint of your lands and territory. How are your people being held economically ransom?
Hadi say Slato Sydney, Gidim Den Hesley. Thank you for having me on the panel today and for organizing all of this. And thanks to all of the other land defenders who are holding it down and occupying their territories and who've helped us occupy our territories and defend them as well. I think that it's a really important issue to remember that all of the lands, all Indigenous lands belong to Indigenous people. All the 22,000 square kilometers of land and all of the economic benefit that flows from those lands belongs to our people. So this idea of the Canadian economy is really a false, theory that the Canadian economy functions and helps, the fabric of Canadian society to continue, and that it's like everything rests on this Canadian economy, which is, which is fabricated and from stolen Indigenous lands and resources. And so when we think about, how the settler state defines the Canadian economy and then blames Indigenous people for holding the economy ransom, and it's really all backwards. It's completely false and completely untrue. So when we see them going to consult the improper authorities, the people that don't actually have jurisdiction, this whole system that they've created with the band councils. In our case with Suatin, we have a very strong governance system. Despite colonization, our governance system still exists, and it still exists in a really real way where we make decisions and have full jurisdiction over 22,000 square kilometers. And so when they go to band councils to consult and there's free prior informed consent that must be obtained, but they're going to the people that don't actually have the authority to consult and to give their permission and to give their consent on those lands. And so they say that they're going to be giving us money, or they're going to provide us with a certain dollar amount to do the consultation. They're going to provide us with a certain amount of money to have economic benefit agreements with these bands, and they're giving us our own money off of our own lands in order to make billions and billions of dollars off of the destruction of those lands by creating these puppets organizations that will so-called benefit from these projects. And so it's really this huge system of it's like a trickster that's trying to convince us that this isn't ours to begin with, and that we're going to benefit, and they're going to give us a little tiny bit of what is actually ours to begin with. And so we just really have to switch that whole way of thinking. And I think that we've been able to do that through this movement and through the reoccupation of our lands, because now we're asserting that we know that these actually belong to us. These are our lands, and you don't get to come and consult us and say, oh, how do you want us to destroy this land? Is there one little section of the land that you would like us to protect or to mitigate for this specific project or that specific project? We're coming back and saying, no, this is our sovereign territory, and we are going to say what you can and can't do in its entirety, and not the other way around. You don't get to decide how we're going to participate. We're going to tell you how you can participate. But that they've tricked most of our society and even our own people into thinking that it's the reverse, that that's the only option. And so this land back movement, this whole sovereignty movement, all of the uprisings that are happening from coast to coast are telling society exactly that we're switching it around. We're going back to our original laws that tell us how to live and how to function within our society and within our lands. And we're not going to accept the false theory of the Canadian economy that has been shoved down our throats since contact. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Molly. And I also just want to welcome the more than 500 people who have joined us from so many different nations. If you haven't, just check out the chat and to give a sense of what a beautiful and powerful convening this already is. I think it indicates the fact that you all know that we are sitting with legends here. But we actually haven't done a proper introduction of all of our panelists. So I'm going to hand that back to Anne to do before we go to Suzanne and Skylar on this same question.
Thanks, Naomi. I got too heated about the state and criminalization, and I forgot to introduce everybody. So I'll do that now and then pass it back to you. So our host and moderator is Naomi Klein. Naomi is in—
You don't have to worry about me, Anne. Just move on.
I'm still doing it. I'm going to do it anyway. You're part of the panel. Naomi is an award-winning New York Times bestselling author of 7 critically acclaimed books published in over 30 languages. She's a senior correspondent at The Intercept and the inaugural Gloria Steinem Endowed Chair at Rutgers University. Our first speaker was Kanahus Manuel. Kanahus is a Katanaka Secwepemc land defender, a member of the Nisconlith Indian Band, daughter of the late leader Arthur Manuel, granddaughter of the late leader George Manuel, 2 deeply respected theorists and politicians who advocated for inherent Indigenous rights. She's the co-founder and resident of the Tiny House Warrior Camp and has faced multiple arrests for defending her lands against the Trans Mountain Pipeline, including recently having her wrist broken last year. We're joined by Molly Wickham, Slido. Molly is Cassia, Grizzly House, Giddimdun clan of the Wet'suwet'en Nation. She's a spokesperson for the Giddimdun Indigenous land reoccupation and a leader of the resistance against the Coastal GasLink pipeline and for Wet'suwet'en self-determination and autonomy on their territories. She was also arrested during the first raid on Wet'suwet'en Yinta in January 2019. We're joined by Skylar Williams. Skylar is Mohawk, a Wolf Clan member, a member and resident of the 6 Nations of the Grand River Territory, and spokesperson for the 1492 land back lane occupation of Mackenzie Meadows Foxgate development. Skylar was served a permanent injunction a few months ago for defending his community's land from development. We're also joined by Suzanne Patlith, is a Mi'kmaq mother, Indigenous activist, lieutenant of the Mi'kmaq Warrior Society, a treaty scholar and law student. Suzanne was on the front lines of the battle against RCMP while she was protecting Elsipogtog lands from SWN resources for fracking on their territory. So thank you all so much. It's such an honor to be in this group of incredible, incredible land protectors. So I'll pass it back to Naomi and on to the next question.
Truly, thank you, Anne. In the chat, there's a question about where to get one of these t-shirts. So Kanahus, step up on the swag in the chat. Tell people where they can order a Tiny House Warriors amazing t-shirt. I want to come back to you, Kanahus and Molly, to talk more in depth about what the counter ransom strategies are. But before we do that, I'd like to hear from Skylar and Suzanne on the same question of how your lands and waters are being held ransom in this moment. I'll start with you, Skylar.
Sorry, trying to get unmuted here. And I think the idea of ransom is something that is, all of us as Indigenous people across the country are dealing with the exact same issues in very, very different ways, of course. But I mean, all of the resource extraction, the development, all of the pipelines, dams that are going on, all of these things that are happening in our Indigenous communities are all part of that, developing the economy while like systematically, pushing away what Indigenous economy is. And so that Indigenous economy for us is that idea that our lands and our language, our culture, our heritage, all of those things that make us Indigenous people, that wherever you're from, that this is who we are, and that's where we lie where we put our wealth. That's what wealth is for us. And so this idea of progress being covering everything in that concrete and asphalt is what progress looks like for us as Haudenosaunee people here at Landback Lane. Like, to be able to see the deer come back, to be able to see the foxes come back to this area, and if our community decides that what's to do with this land after it's been reclaimed is to let Mother Nature take its course and regrow the trees, and because that's the thing, is everything that was beautiful about this area has since been bulldozed over. Every tree, every shrub, every blade of grass has been bulldozed under, and so now it is a bit of barren clay there. And so for us to be able to say absolutely not, that there will be no development on our territory, and so to be able to have our people make the stands that we have been, to be able to say like that the worth of the land is as it is. And so for us, I think it's really impactful when people make these stands, not just here but everywhere. And so in Ontario, there's the Places to Grow Act that was passed recently, and that lies their development in lots of financial help for developers to be able to build within like if you take the Places to Grow Act and then you take our traditional Grand River tract, 6 miles on either side, it lies over that almost perfectly. And so for the Conservative government here in Ontario to try and push developers to develop almost solely on Haudenosaunee territory without any kind of consultation, without any kind of consent, I think that the idea of even having some kind of word with our community, to come to our community in any kind of real way, would have been, at least something, a step in the right direction. And so for us, that idea of holding us ransom is absolutely, hits very near and dear to a lot of us here at Six Nations.
Thank you. Suzanne, can I ask you to speak on the same question?
Yeah, could you repeat the question again, Naomi?
So it's the framing of this whole event, the idea that this is a ransom economy, and to speak specifically about the ways that this plays out in your territory, and also if you want to speak to the counter strategies as well of turning the tables.
All right, I'm from Mi'kmaq territory, and in my territory would be the first place where the settlers had landed in 1497 here in so-called Canada. And that relationship began as a relationship of economy and trade, because my people were one of the first entrepreneurs of this land, where we were, that's where the economic apartheid began, where we were, the ransom economy began from there, where we weren't properly engaged in a proper relationship with the settler society, where we weren't getting the value of the product that we were given out. The other thing that with this ransom economy, the subjugation of Indigenous poverty prevents Indigenous liberation and emancipation unless we reject this concept of recognition of Indigenous rights and title, because that undermines the real self-determination of our nations and our peoples. Because when we resist that legacy that Canada has laid out before us, we have, I'm sure each one of the panelists here today is being investigated by Project Sitka. I know that me and Kanahus, back when the project began, were one of 2 of 87 individuals on that list who were deemed problems to Canada. We were deemed threats to Canada because we were a threat to the Canadian economy, just by voicing our rights and our sovereignty, because our sovereignty and our title is a threat to the privatization of land. And that land has been held ransom against our people since the inception of the British North America Act, where they imposed their settlement within Canada. And settlement began when they started taking claim over our territories and starting to regulate us via political regulations, policy, legislation. And this is where they have been able to create an economic apartheid, even when they're saying they're working towards reconciliation, when reconciliation at the moment is currently levitating this economic apartheid and ransom economy before our eyes, because it's our land that we have to negotiate for our so-called land claims, and these numbers are being held out before us. And that's another form of ransom economy that our people are currently facing all across our Indigenous territories, from the people who are defending on the ground to the people who are sitting across the tables from the government. It affects us all across the board. So I just wanted to end at that. In order to emancipate us from poverty and to rise up as individual nations, we must be able to become equal partners. And when we try to forge forward with our own Indigenous economies, such as in my territory, where we are asserting our right to a moderate livelihood, which means our right to our own economy. And that is being denied when we're certain that out on our waters and out in our lands. And it's not only by the government, but it's also by other people who are anti-Indigenous. And this ethos continues throughout all of Canada, that we are not good enough or equal partners in society.
Thank you, Suzanne. I want to go to all of you and ask if anybody wants to speak specifically about turning the tables on the ransom. What counter strategies in the face of a ransom economy look like specifically? Kenus, do you want to jump in?
Yes, I think a lot about the international, actually, like the whole finance accounting systems of the world and the trade that goes on with Indigenous territories, the resources extracted without our consent throughout the world on the global markets. It's always about getting these raw resources from Indigenous territories out to the global market, get it from landlocked areas on Indigenous territories to tidewater. It's getting it through bottlenecks through these territories that are bringing these risks and uncertainty to these projects. I think that one of the big pushes that we're really trying to make is that we want to hit them where it hurts. They've hit us where it hurt. We want to hit them where it hurts, and that's their pocketbook. That's insurance companies, that's contractors, that's anybody that has any type of interest in our land. Because when we talk about our title and rights as Indigenous people, we're actually talking about that these rights are entitled to our lands are held collectively amongst all of our Indigenous members in our nation, For instance, for the Secwepemc, we have 10,000 plus Secwepemc people that this title is held collectively. Nobody can make a decision without the rest of the remaining collective. You can't sell the land, you can't lease the land, you can't make any type of even mutual benefit agreements with these companies without including our collective as the proper rightful title holders for our nations. We've really looked at what does really it affect, how can we really affect Canada and its pocketbook? How can we show the world that the wealth of Canada is based off of the blood, sweat, and tears and genocide and oppression of us, our Indigenous people. That's how Canada has gotten very wealthy. You know, Canada is the second largest country in the world, and it's one of the wealthiest, and it's from Native land. So how do we start to affect them? And we've always known about blockades. Blockades has been one of our go-tos as Indigenous people when we're talking about direct action. And so blockades is a place where we as Indigenous people, our Indigenous sovereignty and our jurisdiction and our territorial authority will confront the assumed colonial authority and jurisdiction. They think they own the land, but we know we own the land, and the blockade is where we meet. And we have our blockade right there on the Myrtle Lake Road, right behind me. And I love to see Skylar's blockade. It's right in his background of his shot right there. So those blockades are very symbolic in the power that they stand, but also it's a way to affect their economy. And it's saying, no, we're not going to let you make money off of us anymore. We're not going to let you steal our land anymore. We're not going to let you abuse us anymore. We're going to stand up for our creator given rights that we inherited because we were born Secwepemc. And so one of the things we've done is really stood by all the calls to shut down Canada, you know, all the calls to shut them down and to expose that the Canadian economy is based off of the theft of Indigenous territories. And we've been able to go to international banks and insurance companies to get this point across. I mean, insurance companies, you know, insurance is a way for companies to reduce their risk. You know, that's why they're getting insurances. These companies are trying to reduce their risk, but we're saying, no, we're your biggest risk out there. You know, Canada purchased Trans Mountain Pipeline to de-risk it. And we're saying we are the biggest risk that you got. As Indigenous people, our Indigenous sovereignty, our territorial authority, our jurisdiction, you know, all of these are title and rights. Us asserting our title and rights is the biggest risk that the Canadian economy has right now. And we want to make that very clear. These actually calculate to financial risks for these companies. And we could actually calculate it because every single newspaper across the country posted it out there. Shut down Canada cost this much. CN Rail lost this much. These highways lost this much. They'll be able to calculate it. And if you look at all of the injunctions, and all of these hundreds of injunctions that have been put forth against Indigenous people to make way for these companies to come in. Coastal GasLink has an injunction, you know, Trans Mountain has an injunction, the real estate development at Six Nation got an injunction, you know, they got injunctions in Mi'kmaq territory. So we're all very familiar with these injunctions, but in these injunctions, they come with the calculations of how much they're going to lose if the courts do not grant them this injunction. They've invested this much and this is how much they're willing to lose. So we take those exact calculations and we know exactly how much it'll cost them when we shut them down. And we will show them, because when they have their risk management people that are telling them, no, it's all right to invest in oil and gas because it's all right, because we have mutual benefit agreements with these chief and council and that chief and council. Those aren't the proper title holders. They're not going to the proper title holders to get their consent to go through. So still we remain the biggest risk ever for any type of development and investment here in Canada. And we need the proper finance eyes watching this very closely so they don't make mistakes like TMX. They don't make mistakes like Coastal GasLink and this real estate development, because they're going to continue to face opposition and conflict by Indigenous people, because we're not going nowhere and we're not going to stop.
Thank you, Kanahus. I want to give all the other panelists an opportunity to jump in on this question. Skylar, were you interested in adding to that, building on that?
I mean, absolutely. I think this is one of the things that for Indigenous people across the country, and I think when the way that we've been starting to link this movement together across the country, across Turtle Island completely, has made us being able to amplify those voices. And people have heard me say it before, is like Canada has done very diligent, very meticulous work to try and divide us as communities. They placed us on these reserves and drawn these lines across borders and tried to make sure that all of those ancient agreements that we had between all our nations across the country have been able to have been that used to trade with each other, that used to have these family ties with one another, that Canada then started to take advantage of that by running highways and power lines and dams through our communities. And so now that our communities are starting to stand up and our communities are starting to say no to that, holding our communities ransom by continuing to perpetuate that colonization, that genocide that has been placed against our people for the last 500 years. And so for us now to be able to link arms in the way that we have been, to be able to reignite those old fires that kept our communities tied together, to strengthen those old bonds, and say whenever one of our communities, and I don't care whether you're on the East Coast or West Coast or up north or down in the States, we need to be able to stand together. Because when we amplify each other's voices the way that we have been and the way that we continue to do from coast to coast and everywhere in between, I think this is the only opportunity that we have to be able to make sure that when we do the blockades like we're doing, that we can amplify those voices to such a degree that there's no house of government that could ever deny those voices to be heard.
Thank you, Skylar. And Molly, I know your laptop may be starting to fade, so I want to make sure we hear from you on this, because you have built such an extraordinary movement known around the world, a solidarity movement that is the kind of muscle behind the legal and economic claims, right? Because what we know, and I had the extraordinary experience of going with Arthur Manuel some 15 years ago to a meeting he had at Standard & Poor's to make the argument with Gujau to downgrade Canada's credit rating from its AAA because of Indigenous land rights being a debt on the books that is unacknowledged. And essentially what this guy's response was you and what army? You can't enforce it, right? And that, I think, speaks to the kind of dialectic between the rights and the ability to enforce those rights.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a really good point. And that's one of the things that I wanted to talk about is this, land back movement and the reoccupation of our territories. And the fact that, I think that there's certain things that come up that inspire reoccupation of the land and blockades and resistance. And for me, it was, pipelines 10 years ago when Unistoten first came into existence, their occupation of their territory, and I got involved and wanted to go and build a home out in the path of the pipeline with my family. And so we ended up building a home out on the territory. And so it's turned into this, it's turned into something bigger than just a reoccupation of a certain area. It's turned into it's a major lifestyle change. It's more of an Indigenous resurgence. It's in every being, every thread of the way that we live our lives, that makes us stronger, that makes us more in tune with our territories. That when people talk about, well, what about people's livelihoods? What about their livelihoods? People need jobs. What about our livelihoods? The people that are living on the territory, the people that know their laws and are living their laws, are gaining strength from that. Unistoten Healing Center, Unistoten Village, they have hundreds of thousands of supporters. Get 'em Den has hundreds of thousands of supporters around the world. We, all of these occupations, because we're actually living out what we're talking about. We're not just, you know, it's not, you know, maybe it started as a blockade. It started as a way for Get 'em Den. It started as a blockade. We set up a blockade, and the RCMP came in and raided it, got an injunction against us, but we're still living out on the territory. And it's more of a Indigenous resurgence that's spread from coast to coast because of what is happening there. And so we need to look at that and our governance system and the way that we do business within our own nation, that this is what is creating this whole movement. It's not just our experience, but it's what people experience when they go back to their land and reoccupy their land and experience what that freedom is like. Because when we shut down the road, the animals come back. Like Skylar was saying, the animals came back, and Anne can speak to this. You know, she experienced this last winter. As soon as the roads were blocked, and as soon as there was no access, and Wet'suwet'en people had full control over that whole territory for like over a month, the moose came back. All of the animals came back. There were more rabbits, there were wolverines, there were more moose, there were more deer, there was everything just came back to life again. And so we had a Zoom meeting with our Tsakaize last night, and somebody was saying, oh, well, it's never going to get back to the way that it was. Oh, well, it is if you let it be, if you defend it and protect it and let it go back to the way that it was. It will go back to the way that it was. The waters will run clean again. The animals will return, and you can actually live as a free person. And I don't know how many people have actually experienced what that feels like. And we've felt it, even though we're, you know, facing extreme violence from militarized RCMP in the state. But when you're behind that blockade, when you have your whole territory there's not one other single person on there that you haven't consented to being there, and you know exactly what they're doing on your territory, it is such a feeling of empowerment. It is such a feeling of freedom. Like that is what it must feel like to be free Indigenous people. And that's something to fight for. And that's what this movement is all about. It's like the more territory that we occupy, the more we live as Indigenous people, the more that we have, the more freedom that we have, the more we can envision the hope and the realization of our liberation as Indigenous people. And that's what is such a threat to the state. That is what is such a threat to the economy, is that we start out as these this resistance, this blockade, and then we realize what we can do, especially what we can do together with one another from all of our nations, supporting one another and standing behind each other. You know, Kanahus had said they go to court and they argue, these companies, Coastal Gas went to court and argued how much money Wet'suwet'en were costing them and why they had to get a permanent injunction. And it was, Anne was telling me, like from the court case, there's all these documents, they argued it in court themselves. There was $5 million for a delay of 3-month delay, where they couldn't get 9A, one of the man camps, up and running, was $5 million in 3 months. There's another $1 million just recently because they had to move around a cabin out on Wet'suwet'en territory. There's hundreds of thousands of dollars in equipment that, you know, who's going to insure that when equipment is being destroyed or when they can't get it in to do the work? There's all of these things, and I want to say too that it makes a huge difference when you're living there. Like we have, and this is one of the things with land back and the reoccupation, is that when you're living out on the territory or when you're living in a place, it's way harder for them to remove you than if you have something set up there, like if you have a blockade set up. If you're actually an occupant, if you're living on that territory and you're living in that place, it's a lot harder to get rid of you because they actually have to come and remove you out of your home and take down your house, literally. And we know that they've done this in the past. That's what they've always done. That's how they got us onto reserves in the first place. They burned down our homes. They moved us out of there at gunpoint and burned down our homes. So it's not that they won't do it, but it's a lot harder to do than to take down a barricade. It's to remove you out of your home. So we have all of these investment companies, like for CGL, it's KKR, and AIMCO have, 65% of the company and all of this investment. And RCMP, retirement plans are tied up in that. It's a huge conflict of interest to have the RCMP involved when their pensions rely on this investment company in KKR and AIMCO, when people's retirement plans rely on that in the public service. But we have to be able to not only reoccupy and to blockade and to assert our authorities and jurisdictions over our territories, but we have to be able to defend it. And that's one of the ways that we can do that, is by being out on our territories, recreating our strength, and breathing life into our laws again. And that's how we defend, and that's how we get stronger, and that's how we train people to to uphold their laws, and educate people to uphold their laws, and to get involved, and to know that it's not their right, it's their responsibility to do so. It's their inherent responsibility to do so. And so it's a much larger picture than just occupying, one site for a certain amount of time to cost money. This is this is the long game that's going to cost them the land, because we're taking it back.
Now, if we were in a room full of humans, there would be like a standing O right now. So just like, feel that, Molly. Suzanne, how does this sound on the East Coast? What is the same and what is different? We've all, you faced injunctions standing up against fracking companies. And also we've just seen extraordinary settler racist violence in the fisheries. So what are the commonalities? What are the differences?
Well, a lot of the commonalities, when I first met Kanahus back in 2013, this was a big part of our discussion. How do we fight against this economic apartheid, against this ransom economy? What are counter strategies for this type of oppression and destitution? So we actively strategized for many, many years. And we've always said that it always comes down to affecting their pocket and the economics of their, economics of their business. And that example could be seen back when we were fighting SWN in Elsipogtog back in 2013, when the settler colonial government imposed an injunction against myself and other individuals at that time. And they had imposed several injunctions because of how much we were costing the company per day when it came down to standing up against these companies. But it's important to remember that it's this economic apartheid that has created multiple opponents against our liberation and against our emancipation, because it's not only the colonial government that we have to step up against, it's also industry and development that we have to step up against and to actively fight in order for us to be able to be equal participants as rightfully so. Like in my territory, we had treaties, but not with Canada. We had treaties with the Crown to be equal participants within society, to be like this. And somehow the authority got delegated and they are now our oppressor. So what's important for you to, when you are fighting, and we're using this SWN as an example, is when you are doing your actions and you are doing your different ways of actively fighting against a corporation, for example, you have to really pay attention to how those actions affect their pocketbook. And when a company such as SWN is registered on the stock market, then you're able to see how those actions actively affect their pocket, how it is getting their investors to pull out from there. Because when we began our our activity against SWN, they were worth almost $50 per share. And right now, if you check them out, they're less than $3 a share. So we were able to literally, annihilate that company because of our stance against fracking, which, it not only worked against that company, but it ignited a stance against dirty industry and how they use those dirty ways to extract from our territories and keep us still poor, and they still keep us, oh my God, they still keep us so below everybody. And out in here in our territory, when we were recognized by the court to have a right to a moderate livelihood, which, as I explained earlier, that's our right to our own economy. When we have that type of right, and it's different here. When we were trying to assert that right, we actually got an injunction against the angry fishermen, the angry commercial fishermen, and not much was done with that injunction. It was a piecemeal, it felt like a piecemeal thing that really didn't do much of anything. Yeah, I understand that there may have been one person or two people charged for breaching that injunction, as opposed to when an injunction is set against Indigenous people, there's usually multiple people violently taken down in order to, to prove that injunction valid. And when it comes to us having an injunction against anybody, it's not seen as equitable. So that there's no equality in when there's injunctions for us, or as opposed to when they're against us. We see more violence, we see more threats, and then we see us being put on terrorist threat lists, us being called different things. But when we stand up against those kind of things, but I also see counter actions, such as anybody could do whatever they can. It's not necessarily standing up in the front lines, because everybody has a role to play. And we always discuss this, whether it be through art, through music, through their storytelling, as you've done, Naomi, through your books. You've been able to amplify our voices from the front lines. Such as people going online, creating blogs, doing all these different ways in expressing our sovereignty and our authority in our lands and territories, and how we are rising against the oppressor, and we are looking for equal stance within this territory. And when we try to have an equal playing field, such as you've seen out here with the purchase of Clearwater Seafoods, a lot of individuals want to consider that under the umbrella of the moderate livelihood fishery, which is not, because when we want to participate in the commercial fishery, we have every right to participate in that, which is completely separate from the moderate livelihood fishery. And a moderate livelihood is definitely not achieved when people in my community are 75% of my community is still living in poverty. So it's obviously not achieved when a big population of your people are still living in poverty. And it's within these front lines where people are supporting and lending their support and flourishing their art and their beautiful things, that they're able to really out of the ashes of the oppression that we face, we're able to really rise up against this oppression and really empower one another for our liberation and our emancipation, in order to really become equal people within this land. And it's equality that we're all fighting for. We're all fighting for our voices to be not only recognized, we're really sick of that recognition. We really want the power to be able to have a seat at the table. And the words came out of Kanahus's father perfectly. We have to stop crying on the shoulder of the oppressor to get to get what we want across. And it's not going to happen through that avenue. It's going to happen through us really standing up and really pulling at the roots of this colonial history and changing it over and bringing the true stories out. And that's what we did when we stood up against the statue of Cornwallis. We were unearthing history when people thought we were actually destroying it. And that's what we're doing all the time when we are out there. And we are unearthing the true history of colonial Canada. And we are using that truth in order to empower and emancipate our nations.
Wow, thank you so much, Suzanne. There's so much love for all of you in the chat. I hope that you're reading it. Um, and you can tell there's lots of great organizers in this chat, because I was looking at all of these great reading suggestions, and links to different groups going by, thinking somebody needs to compile this and we need to get it before the chat disappears. And sure enough, somebody stepped up and already has done that and is compiling it. There's a link. So if you want to make sure not to lose all this collective wisdom in the chat, copy that link. And I'll be there, all the book recommendations and film recommendations, and ways to buy t-shirts, etc. Yes, I'm really struck by what Suzanne is talking about unearthing the history, the real history, and the stories beneath the story of colonial Canada, and that you have all been so much a part of. I want to talk a little bit about something that Anne mentioned at the beginning, which is that all of you have, you're not talking at an arm's length when you talk about criminalization, when you talk about being arrested for defending your land. It's something that you've all experienced. All of your struggles have faced this strategy of injunctions. And we are in a global reckoning and rising movement against mass incarceration, for prison abolition. And I would love to hear any of you who want to speak to where you see your struggles fitting into that global movement. Skylar, you want to start?
I certainly can, yeah. No, and actually I'm going to take you guys for a little walk while I'm talking here. Because for us here at Land Back Lane, that idea of that criminalization is something that is something that we're dealing with every day. I don't know if you're going to be able to see it from here. There's on the other side of the barricade there's a line, and that line is constantly manned every day. But you can't quite see it in the video, but there is a line there of about 20 cops over there who sit there every day, all day, day in and day out, to make sure that that are sitting there with guns on us every day. Like, this isn't an idea that we are somehow not the peaceful occupation that this has been since the very start. For us, this has been, and we kind of jokingly say it's been kumbaya by the fire here for 145 days now. And so for us to continue that work, to be able to maintain that peace here, because that's the thing, is the only days that there's ever been any violence here is on the days that the OPP come in shooting rubber bullets, that the OPP come in shooting and tasering and dragging our women off our lands. The one guy got tasered in the neck and head, another guy got his face dragged along the pavement. And so these are the things that criminalization, this is the what that looks like for us here. And so when we tried to defend ourselves in the civil proceedings against the injunction, the judge actually struck everything that I had said and barred me from participating in my own defense. And so for us to be launching the appeal now, to be working as hard as we are, and our legal team is working as hard as they are, because I was self-represented. Because at the time we didn't have any money to be able to afford a lawyer, to be able to progress any of the court action that we started. And so we spent the better part of 2 months learning how to be lawyers, learning how to be civil lawyers, to be able to defend ourselves. And so that work to be able to figure out all of the things that we needed to do. And so now we've launched that appeal. We filed that, and so hopefully we'll be seeing some fruit from all of those labors that myself and some family and friends, none of whom are lawyers, but I'm very, very lucky in my friends that are amazingly smart. And so to see all of the folks that have been doing all of the work to make sure that we're pushing forward. And so for the criminalization part of it, like the criminal charges. Like right now, we've got somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 people that have been charged already, that are already going through the court process. And that was before, roads got dug up. Because that's the thing is here, after the last time the OPP came in shooting, several roads were dug up, railways were dug up, the highway was dug up, and the bus that you see behind me was placed across the road. And so this is what we've done here to be able to protect ourselves from that massive force of the OPP coming in with, and I say it all the time, that the OPP only has one language, and that's one of violence. And so if that is the only arm of the state of Ontario, of government of Canada, to be able to talk with, to engage with Six Nations, is that of violence, the language of violence, in order to settle land claims, to be able to put our people behind bars, behind the weight of bail and release conditions, to be able to stop. Like, this is what land claims looks like in Ontario. This is what land claims looks like across the country, across Turtle Island, is to be able to put them down by these criminal charges, to be able to scare people off. And I think, at least here anyways, and is something that we've seen over and over and over again across the country, is that people now are starting to say, you know what, there is nothing that these courts or these cops, their guns or their jails, could do to us to dissuade us from pushing forward to protecting those rights, not of ours, but of the next 7 generations. And so for us to be able to keep that in mind every time that we make the stands that we're making, with the police in the background, with that massive enforcement mechanism pushing against us. Like, this is what we need to do. Because what kind of jerk would I be to be able to have that conversation with my granddaughter or grandson one day of why I didn't fight for the land? Because I was scared, because I was unable to, because the cops had guns, because the cops had jails, because the courts wanted them to enforce this against their people. Like, this is something that I'm not willing to have that conversation with my grandkids. And so for us to be able to continue to push the way that we are, and to make sure that we're strengthening those ties between all of our nations, is something that, and not just within all of the nations across Canada here, but with all our allies as well, to be able to push that forward, so that, because, like, we wouldn't be able to be here for the 145 days that we've been here now without the massive swell of allyship that we've been able to create across all of Turtle Island. And like, we've had help from everywhere. And so I have a huge debt of gratitude toward all the people that are continuing to push our GoFundMe campaign, that are doing helping out the camp and build funds here. We've got tiny houses being built. We've got everything so that we can sustain ourselves through the winter. And so, like, I just want to make sure that I send a big thank you to all those people. And so it's an amazing thing to be able to do this work with all of these people behind us.
Thank you, Skylar, and thanks for that tour. And I feel like there's so much Zoom fatigue, and I think that there's so many ways in which we want to be with movements in the streets and in rooms, but there's also something really powerful, I think, about being able to speak to you on your land. And I want to go to you, Kanahus, and Molly, just to maybe speak a little bit about, well, start with you, Kanahus, like what it means for you to be able to be doing this work on the land right now. In the big picture, we only have 20 minutes left together. And maybe talk a little bit too about international law and UNDRIP, and whether that's a tool that can be counted on, or how we make that more meaningful.
Yeah, thank you, Skylar, too, and bringing us there to the front line. It really inspires us, and the school bus is really educating a lot of people throughout Canada, I think. But I want to just say thank you to everybody that's on here. I've been watching everybody's chats too, coming up. But I just to go specifically to the UNDRIP and to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and we know that Canada never wanted to sign on to it to begin with, and they end up becoming a signatory after the fact. And now Canada is trying to implement Bill C-15, which is, implement a domesticated form of UNDRIP, and, talking to all our international connections and lawyers and people in the human rights field and saying, no, you can't domesticate an international, law. Like those are declaration. And like my dad said, it's a declaration, it's not law, and there's covenants like the Committee on Elimination of the or the it's not the committee, but they do have a committee, but the elimination of the racial discrimination and CERD, and how we've been pushing forth with our international
Convention.
The convention. And so Canada is a signatory, and that means they're a signatory to this international law, to really for these human rights laws that they're supposed to abide by. And CERD actually made a statement to Canada, like response to us when we said, okay, Coastal GasLink and Trans Mountain and Site C, they're all violating our Indigenous rights. They don't have the free, prior, informed consent of the Indigenous people. They're not going to the proper title holders to get this consent. And the UN CERD responded back to Canada, actually ordering a halt to the construction of the Coastal GasLink pipeline, ordering a halt to the construction of the Trans Mountain pipeline, to revoke the permits, and also Site C, and to revoke the permits, and to, until they could get the proper free, prior, informed consent of the Indigenous people. And of course, Canada never made any moves on that. They've completely ignored these human rights laws that they're a signatory to. And so, their reasoning behind pushing the UNDRIP is really not reconciliation. I believe that it's only to create more certainty for investors that, no, look here, we're really working with the Indigenous people. We passed this UNDRIP. We're really getting free, prior, informed consent from Indigenous people, but it's really just a smokescreen. And you can see it specifically on the ground, them deploying police right there to 1492 Landback Lane, them deploying police daily to, to Molly's home, to our home. Mm-hmm. And you can see that their intentions are never good. And, even with the injunctions, my father called that Canada's legal billy club. And you see the police, how they're coming, how the RCMP are acting right now, with Canada purchase of this pipeline, with big, huge TC Energy, the owner of Coastal GasLink. They have a new RCMP division called the Community Industry Response Group, CERG, and their only reason for making this new division was to defend the interest of Coastal GasLink and Trans Mountain Pipeline, and they're not hiding that fact. And that's where it gets very, scary, because they have their own police division to deal with Indigenous sovereignty, to continue to oppress us and criminalize us. They have so much, like we've been able to get freedom of information to see how much surveillance and spying on us they actually have done. And we've received hundreds of pages of actually that Trans Mountain TMX Corporation are actually spying on us. And they have hired their own private security, including many retired RCMP that actually hold rank over these RCMP that are deployed on the ground. Although they're not working for the RCMP, they do hold higher rank when they left the field than CERG and some of the police that they're deploying on the site for us. Myself, we last year we went and reoccupied an area, land back at a Moonbeam camp, and we actually timed it 3 days until the choppers came. 2 days the cruisers came. 3rd day the choppers came. 4th day more vehicles came. On the 5th day my wrist was broken and I was arrested on bogus, politically motivated charges that I'm still defending, that I'm still suing these cops for. They want to hurt us. They want to harm us. They want to bring violence to us, and they want to they want us to be an example of, if any other land defenders stand up, this is what's going to happen. You're going to get your wrist broken. You're going to be violated. You're going to, you're going to be, face down on the ground. But it's not deterring. And I think that that's one of the things that corporations have been able to hide behind for so long, is that, don't worry, we have an injunction process. Don't worry, we have the police. But with these big anti-police movements and abolish the police movements and defund these police movements, the police are really being exposed of how they have been formed and how they use, and the intricate ways that they actually contribute and are accomplices to our genocide. And there's been cases in the past, the Nuremberg trials, and the places where they've actually took civil servants and they said, okay, you violated human rights, you violated these rights, 20 years ago, and actually being found guilty for human rights crimes. And that's what's going to happen one of these days with these RCMP and these civil servants that are signing these permits, and these civil servants that are still pushing through to get access to our territories. They're going to be tried for human rights crimes, and they're going to be found guilty because they are violating every single day that they push through with pipelines and these real estate developments on our territories.
Thank you so much, Kanahus, and thank you for bringing us all together. This is Kanahus's idea, and she knew exactly who she wanted to have in conversation, and nobody says no to Kanahus, and I think that you can see why. She's such an incredible leader. Molly, I would love to hear some final thoughts from you, basically about anything you want to say. So I'm not going to ask you a question.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for Kanahus for inviting me onto this panel, and we had a good conversation the other day. And yeah, I just want to touch on a few things. For one, the UNDRIP and these international laws and the framework of the UNDRIP. And I really, really believe that, I agree with Kanahus that this is just about insurance for investors, that it's just all this smokescreen to say, okay, we're trying to play nice, we're giving them a say, whatever. So the governments are trying to come up with well, how are they going to implement UNDRIP? Well, it's not up to them. Us as Indigenous people, we decide how UNDRIP is implemented. UNDRIP gets implemented according to our laws on our land, and it's different for every nation. Our specific governance system is very clear about how we implement free, prior, informed consent. And so that's how we should be implementing UNDRIP. And we say how it gets done on our land, not the other way around. It's not going to be a cookie cutter, the government figured it out how they're going to do free, prior, informed consent with Indigenous people. No, that's wrong and backwards. So we have to be the ones to show them how that's going to be implemented. I think that the abolishing the police, it's like Kanahus said, we have our own special SERG team, our own special police that are out on our territories every single day, that come to our homes just to make sure we're safe and to check on everybody. They come and harass us. They have 5 different security companies out on the territories for Coastal GasLink that they tell Coastal GasLink tells the RCMP who to arrest, when, and how, and what to do with them. They give them direction, clear as day. We've watched them come up to us in ceremony and say, okay, go and arrest them now. Get them out of the way. We face the threat of arrest every single day. The first raid on Wet'suwet'en territory at Gidimt'en checkpoint was 14 people with over 50 to 75 militarized RCMP with snipers. Currently, we have dog teams, the K9 unit out on our territories, patrolling our territory with dogs, police dogs. We have the DLTs who are constantly on the territory. We have SERG, and then of course the other, all of the private security teams that come and harass and surveil us daily. And actually, funnily, it's a little light in our day is they drive into the ditches because they're filming us. They aren't watching where they're going and drive themselves right into the ditch, right in front of camp. So it's really obvious, the surveillance and the helicopters on a daily basis. And so this is how we are living our lives at this point. And it's just something that we have to do. You know, some people say, well, how do you just make it through the day? Like, how do you keep going with this? And it's just not a choice. Like Skylar was saying, like, there's no option to just quit. You don't just get to quit. Like, you know, we don't just get to leave. We don't get to go away. We are here forever. We will be here forever. We're not going anywhere. And there is no quit. There is no quit until everybody experiences that freedom that I was talking about before. Everybody experiences what that feels like in their bodies, to be free and to have full control over their territories and to know and hope and have hope for the future and for their grandchildren. So I think that that's really what we're fighting for, and that we do have, we have a really opportune time right now. This with COVID happening, there's a lot of horrible things that are happening, but there's also like this really great thing that's happened is that society's just been turned on its head. Everything has had to change. And so that just goes to show people that everything can change and the world won't fall apart. Things, and there are really good benefits that come out of that you may not have expected. Like the environment is the lands and the waters, other than, these projects that are being pushed through while COVID's happening. In other places in the world where everything's shut down, everything is replenishing. Things are coming back. Things are being the air, the quality is better. People are spending more time with their families. There are really good things that are happening when we totally change the way that we're living. And that's the key, is like, we can't just say, oh, let's just, get our piece of the pie. No, people have to change the way that they're living. Everybody has to change the way that society functions right now, or we're just going to be the brown people exploiting our own territory. Things have to fundamentally change. And we can do that. And we have the power in this time to be able to do that, because things are very unstable. The economy is already unstable with Shutdown Canada happening and then COVID happening. And we need to take this opportunity and run with it. We need to do everything that we can so that our kids don't have to fight as hard as we do, so that our kids don't have to face criminalization and jail time for upholding their own laws and for just being an Indigenous person on their land. They don't have to go to jail for that. They don't have to face jail time. They don't have to, face criminalization and slander and like all of the other horrific harms of colonization just to be and exist. And so we have to take advantage for sure of this opportunity in this time in our history, and the opportunity that we have to build those alliances with other nations and support one another and say that's it's enough is enough, and this is the end for that. So I think that we need to do that now, and to push harder, and to just keep pushing harder even when we think that we can't anymore, and to be watching the front lines, like to watching the RCMP come into Kanahus's home, and to watch the RCMP, the OPP and the police and what they're doing at Lamback Lane and the other front lines all over from coast to coast. So
Thank you. Thank you so much, Molly. And I think, it needs to be said that the very fact that these industrial projects, whether it's a gas pipeline, whether it's an oil pipeline, or whether it's a housing development, that this is going on in the midst of a pandemic that is worsening all over the country. We're not supposed to have anything but non-essential activity going on. And it's being pushed through precisely because it is harder to organize in the middle of a pandemic. When it comes to oil and gas, it's completely outrageous. There is a glut of oil and gas because people aren't flying, because people aren't driving in the same ways. So there's too much gas. You don't need to ram through a pipeline. It's pure disaster opportunism. It is itself an outrage. Suzanne, could I ask you for some closing remarks?
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to like the conversation of defunding the police movements and what that does for our movements here on Indigenous territories. Back in 2014, me and Kanahus approached the North American Indigenous Caucus on the criminalization of Indigenous peoples on the front lines and how that should be characterized as political prisoners of war, because it's highly recognized throughout academia and throughout our Indigenous territories that blockades are the seeds of our self-determination as a people, that is where we are able to pull out the roots of history and able to gather together and empower one another and make decisions collectively from the ground up. And when those actions are trampled on and encroached by police violence, such as back in 2013 in Elsipogtog, where they first used the emergency response team against Indigenous people who are asserting their rights on the land. A lot of people thought that that was the military, even because of how hard they came in at that time. And it's important to note that when we continue to express those ideologies that yes, those who are arrested on the front lines are political prisoners of war, that we start to bring people's thoughts and their interpretations of what is actually happening into the Indigenous perspectives, because it's really important that we are able to open up people's eyes to our own interpretations of what we are experiencing, not only experiencing, but what we believe and what we truly think. Because in order for anybody to understand, they haven't felt, a lot of people haven't felt, our supporters, our non-Indigenous supporters or supporters across the world do not understand how it is to be subjugated by this colonial influence for hundreds and hundreds of years, trying to rise up against the oppressor just to be recognized as human and equal partners within society. And even to get to that level, we've been having this strife for so long. So it's important for us to even rise up against this oppression, that we must start to inform people about the interpretation and inform people about how they should be thinking about these issues, and to continue to educate the larger public on what actually is happening and what actually is going on within these territories. Because, and I loved what Skylar Williams had said, and me and Kanahus and also Molly have discussed this in the past, where if one part of our body is hurt, the whole body should feel it. So each one of us across Turtle Island is a part of that body. And when one of us feels it, we should feel it throughout the whole body, and we should all rise up as one body in order for us to be able to rise up and to really come together and become that powerful force that we really truly need in this day and age. Because with these viruses and with this, everything that is happening in society, it's a disease, and it's I'm sorry to say it, Indigenous people are the cure. We really have the cure for all of these sicknesses and this oppression. Like, we will be able to come if we're just listen to us, stop recognizing us and listen to what we have to say.
Oh my goodness. That is a note to wrap on. Thank you so much. So many recommendations for great books, but I dare say that you wouldn't get a better education than just listening to this again, or sharing the link with people who weren't able to attend. This has been an extraordinary education, and just the amount of love in the chat is just overwhelming. So make sure to soak it in. And I want to hand it over to Ann Spice for some final remarks. Thank you all. It's been a true honor to be in conversation with you. Thank you for defending the land, the water, and our shared home.
Thank you so much, Naomi. And I also just want to say thank you to everyone who joined us here and everyone who's following along in the chat. To close, I just want to offer a part of a piece that I've been writing about criminalization, and then just leave it at that. We do not walk in two worlds, or the two worlds are not the old ways and the modern world, as some would have it. We exist on our lands within a web of relations that are as old as time itself. When we defend the land, we are not creating barriers to outside forces, but deepening connections and responsibilities that have always been there, connections and relations that have held us and shaped us and created us as peoples. Colonial power attempts at every turn to redefine our worlds, to draw the old meanings out of our lives and inscribe these colonial relationships on everything, to make us think that this is the way it must be and has always been. Our hunting grounds become construction sites. Our ancient trails become highways. Our rivers are technical problems. Our medicines are cleared for more profitable things. We are meant to look at the photographs of police officers on our territories and see nothing unusual. The daily patrols fold into the rhythm of life for us. Police control is normalized. Our existence has always been criminal. We walk in our own world, this world born of rivers spilling from Raven's Beak, this world watched over by glacier women, this world where light spills from cedar boxes into the sky, this world where our ancestors walk and whisper to us from mossy corners of the forest. And the colonizers, they walk all over us. Here is what we must remember. When the police patrol ancient trails, they are walking in a world in which they do not and cannot belong. A world that will not claim them as it claims us. Our storytelling is powerful because it is a reminder of our belonging, a reminder that the invasion, the conquest is not normal or natural or the way things need to be, a reminder that we are connected to this land. We need to choose to live in this reality, the one where we are free and autonomous on our lands, the one where our lives and stories matter. This other world is a smokescreen, a cheap simulation, and we can see through it. When we speak of decolonization or land back or whatever the current language of resistance offers, we're talking about peeling back this layer of violence that has literally settled over Indigenous lands. We're talking about naming this system as oppressive, violent, foreign, and out of place. These lands do not belong to Canada, and Canada does not belong here. We're talking about treating our Indigenous laws as if they are the law. They are. About treating Indigenous peoples as if they are the people. We are. About treating other oppressed peoples here as our honored guests, about finding reciprocal relations with those who are capable and powerful and generous enough to return the gifts we have given them. Neo-fascist and white supremacist movements also attempt to make a deeply hierarchical societal order appear to be the natural order of things. This is an old colonial trick, and one that Indigenous people know about. We can be on the lookout for the naturalization of the carceral. Who belongs in power? Who belongs in jail? When does the rule of law apply? Whose laws apply? How is our mobility limited? When are our movements surveilled? How are our actions made suspect? Whose power is threatened by our existence? Carcerality seeps into our relations, into our dreams, but we can shake off the illusion. Colonizers have never been much good at magic. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone, again. Please share. Thank you.